is distracted from the important issues.
And welcome back to the show. I scream, you scream. You know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest. I scream, you scream, you know the rest. I scream, you scream, well, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, well, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, we all, well, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, we all know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, well, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
Mike Myers says, yeah, baby.
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 Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Mike Myers says, yeah, baby.
Mike Myers says, yeah, baby.
Mike Myers says, yeah, baby.
Mike Myers says, yeah, baby.
Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Mike
Myers.
A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday.
A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday.
A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday.
First, the severe flooding here in the Northeast as more rain continues to fall today. NBC's Michelle Kaczynski, I guess she's in the canoe, is in Wayne, New Jersey this morning.
Hey,
Michelle, good morning to you.
Good morning. Well, obviously we're getting a nice break from the rain, but not the flooding. This is essentially now a part of the Passaic River in this neighborhood. It rushed in yesterday. I just got a picture of the conditions that Kayla Brown has been living in for the past 2 months. Essentially, she was by the neck inside of what would look like a steel cage, roughly 4 by 4 by 6, and that steel cage was then inside of a larger container. Now, a massive search is underway in this field behind me because the victim herself told police that she believes as many as 4 bodies may be buried here. George?
Boy, that is just horrific. Okay, Lindsay.
An ABC News producer is being investigated by the network after reported evidence that a live camera shot on Good Morning America was doctored by falsely stringing police tape in the background. The shot featured reporter Lindsay Davis in Woodruff, South Carolina, where a woman was allegedly held captive in a storage container by a registered sex offender. Behind Davis, yellow police tape can be seen with the words, "Sheriff's Line, do not cross." A wider photograph of the scene shows that police tape was actually just attached to some ABC camera equipment to enhance the scene.
Dateline NBC, a primetime news program, airs a story in 1992 entitled Waiting to Explode. The story includes footage demonstrating that a line of trucks produced by General Motors readily explode on impact.
To see for ourselves what might happen in a side impact crash, Dateline NBC hired the Institute for Safety Analysis to conduct crash demonstrations. Unlike GM tests, the fuel tanks were filled with real gasoline. Look what happened. At impact, a small hole was punctured in the tank. According to our experts, the pressure of the collision and the crushing of the gas tank forced gasoline to spew from the gas cap. The fuel then erupted into flames when ignited by the impacting car's headlight.
After the program airs, one of the firemen at the taping of the crash contacts GM. The conversation inspires a full-scale investigation. 3 months later, NBC is forced to reveal their role in fabricating the news.
NBC's contractor did put incendiary devices under the trucks to ensure that there would be a fire if gasoline were released from the truck's gas tank.
We said the crash, quote, forced gasoline to spew from the fuel cap, end quote. GM says since the gas cap was the wrong cap for the GM filler tube, and because the gas tank was overfilled, the cap came off when the impact occurred.
We agree with GM that we should have told our viewers about these devices.
The Dateline reporter, however, said, quote, at impact, a small hole was punctured in the tank, unquote. GM has now x-rayed that tank and found no hole.
We acknowledge the placing of the incendiary devices under the truck was a bad idea from start to finish.
That's our new policy, and we'll be right back.
Look at a pyramid. In the first couple layers,